Hey everyone, welcome back. We're seeing continued progress on Artemis II launch preparations as Exploration Ground Systems closes in on a major Orion milestone. They are wrapping up commodity loading and servicing work, and the flight crew got on board the spacecraft in the processing building at the end of the week for a couple of pre-launch tests. When Orion moves, it will go to the building where it will be encapsulated in its launch abort system, and after that is done, the spacecraft should be ready for stacking. I'll go through those details and much better clarity about what's going on with the Artemis III SLS core stage build. After last week's unexplained movement of the engine section bow tail all by itself, we saw the engine section itself move into the VAB. But this week, Boeing and NASA explained what's happening now and what the outlook is for the rest of the year after that. NASA's budget and workforce situation remains unresolved. Congress may be able to save the programs for now, but the White House just finished one arm-twisting retirement program and are now moving on to plans for large contractor layoffs. It remains to be seen how these large layoffs will affect the downstream missions like Artemis III and IV, but those are the ones that the White House doesn't want to do. And without the workforce, they may get their way regardless of how much money Congress appropriates. On Wednesday, July 30th, NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs posted another set of pictures around the periphery of Vehicle Assembly Building High Bay 3, where the Artemis II SLS rocket is stacked on Mobile Launcher 1. These pictures were taken on July 24th. They provide a few wider shots of what one can see walking around the integration cell right now. Exploration Ground Systems Integrated Operations is working through integrated test and checkout of the systems and connections between the flight boosters and stages and the ground-side mobile launcher. The goal is to have the SLS systems and connections with the ground launch command and control systems tested by the time that the Orion spacecraft arrives in the VAB for stacking, hopefully in a couple of months. The other piece of SLS is the spacecraft connector called the Orion Stage Adapter, which will be stacked before the spacecraft. That connects Orion in its encapsulated launch configuration with the in-space second stage for this Block 1 crew configuration of SLS, the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage, or ICPS. The last we heard, the OSA was still at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, but would be shipped to KSC this month of August. The OSA also provides a small amount of room for secondary CubeSat payloads that will be installed and configured for flight once the adapter arrives at the launch site. The Artemis II flight crew held a Q&A media session that same day, July 30th, at the KSC PAO News Center. Although questions were restricted to media who were there in person to cover the Crew 11 launch to the International Space Station, KSC Public Affairs did provide audio of the session, and the crew provided a note here or there about vehicle preparations. I've noted in past videos that strakes were going to be attached to the core stage intertank on either side of the two solid rocket booster forward attach points, so 4 of them in total. But the crew said that activity now was in progress. If we look more closely at the pictures taken on July 24th, we can see that enclosures are set up around those areas, so we can't see the status of the work at the time of the images. It's not clear if all of them are installed yet, and they will need to be closed out with spray-on foam insulation, but that's another thing to ask about in coming weeks. The flight crew was at KSC this past week for some of their first work inside their Orion spacecraft. The Artemis II Orion is still in the multi-payload processing facility in the KSC industrial area, where Exploration Ground Systems was completing loading of hazardous and non-hazardous commodities on the spacecraft for flight. During the 3 months it's been in the MPPF, EGS Spacecraft Offline Operations has loaded storable propellant in tanks on the service module and crew module, gases for the crew cabin atmosphere, ammonia for thermal control loops, and helium to pressurize the propellant tanks. The plan was for the flight crew to take part in a couple of tests inside the crew compartment when all that loading was more or less complete, and NASA KSC Public Affairs confirmed that they would take part in a suited test or tests on Thursday, July 31st. Then, the next day, Friday, August 1st, they were going to do a crew equipment interface test as another session to evaluate the layout of all the equipment inside. At the end of the work week, Commander Reed Weissman posted the weekly crew update video on Instagram on his @astro_Reed account. This image of the crew comes from the end of the video, which are always worth watching. I put a link to that in the description. This is on the upper level of the servicing stand in the MPPF, with the primary crew in launch and entry suits. In the video, Weissman is sitting next to backup crew member Andre Douglas and notes that Jenny Gibbons, the Canadian Space Agency backup crew member, was inside the crew compartment with the others. And we can see some of the support people in this still that is at the end of the video and during the rest of it, including closeout crew members. We'll be looking for more imagery of those tests, hopefully next week, and also an update on when Orion will move from the MPPF to the Launch Abort System facility, which will be a big milestone in launch preparations. EGS Spacecraft Offline Operations is getting Orion ready to stack on SLS in the Vehicle Assembly Building, and that's where it will go after the work in the LASIF. We actually got a rare glimpse inside the Launch Abort System facility in this social media post on July 31st. A group of NASA interns took a picture inside the LASIF, and we can see the Artemis II LAS tower and two of the ogive fairing panels in frame. It's not specified when the picture was taken, but it's reasonable to assume this is fairly recent given the condition of the hardware, the placement of the hardware, and the work platforms in the far background. At the end of the week, KSC PAO provided an update on Orion spacecraft preparations in the MPPF. Servicing of the two outstanding commodities, the hydrazine and gaseous helium for the crew module propulsion system, is complete, and PAO says that there are no other servicing activities planned in the MPPF. Before the spacecraft can be moved from the MPPF to the LASIF, it needs to go through some closeouts. Kind of like shutting down a desktop computer, you don't just pull the power cord. The system goes through an orderly closeout first before power down. Orion itself has to be configured for the move, powered down, and disconnected from all the equipment in the MPPF. But now that the commodity servicing in the MPPF is complete, we'll be looking for that transport out of the MPPF to the Launch Abort System facility. When Orion moves to the LASIF, when it heads to the VAB, and when Orion, SLS, and the mobile launcher are ready for that final stacking are all scheduled drivers for launch readiness. At this point, NASA is looking at launch periods and launch windows behind the scenes, but launch preparations and launch readiness are still somewhat independent of the launch windows early next year. At some point, those have to converge, but for now the focus for the flight hardware is getting the full vehicle integrated, completing integrated test and checkout, and finishing rollout and launch preparations. The goal was to be ready to stack Orion on SLS by the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, and NASA has about 2 months left to finish those preparations. The bigger goal was to be ready to roll the vehicle out to the pad for launch by the end of the year. We've been watching launch processing all year and probably will for the rest of the year. NASA has not updated their interim milestone schedules in public all year, so that's something else we're continuing to look for. A lot of the mystery about what's happening with the engine section for the Artemis III SLS core stage was cleared up after more hardware movement this week. At the end of last week, NASA posted a set of stills showing that the bow tail, which is part base heat shield, part fairing, had showed up in the transfer aisle of the Vehicle Assembly Building at KSC. The bow tail attaches to the bottom of the engine section barrel, and in fact that operation was completed almost a year ago in the late summer, early fall of 2024. So that started the mystery. Why was the bow tail now disconnected from the engine section? Why was it headed to the VAB? Even though Boeing's Core Stage Vertical Integration Center is waiting for the Artemis III hardware, the few indications we'd heard going back to the beginning of this year was that the engine section wasn't ready for final assembly. Earlier versions of the final assembly plan were to finish engine section integration with the bow tail in the Space Systems Processing Facility at KSC, and then move them to the CSVIC, which is in VAB High Bay 2. So it wasn't that the bow tail is in the VAB as much as 1, why was it moved there now, and 2, why was it moved there by itself, destacked from the engine section. The bow tail was moved to the VAB on Thursday, July 24th, and then around midday on Tuesday, July 29th, we got a heads up that the engine section was being driven up Kennedy Parkway, so obviously it was headed to the same location, the VAB transfer aisle. NSF NASA Spaceflight's Space Coast Live 24/7 live streaming cameras at the KSC press site picked up the convoy as it turned onto Saturn Causeway, which is how one gets to the press site. They turned left to go to the VAB and rolled the engine section into the low bay south end of the transfer aisle a few minutes before the Crew 11 Falcon 9 first stage was static fired. This is the first time we've seen the core stage 3 engine section in 6 months. Most of the work to outfit it is on the inside, so it's harder to judge progress, but it doesn't look like much additional thermal protection system work on the exterior has been done. Some of the detailing that we typically see as the element nears readiness to be mated to the rest of the stage. So we weren't expecting the hardware to move until it was done. It's not done yet, but it was moved for some other reason. I was finally able to get informative updates from both Boeing and NASA Marshall Space Flight Center Public Affairs the next day, Wednesday, July 30th. First, Boeing posted a news article which helped to mostly clarify what was happening. NASA KSC Public Affairs also published photos and video taken on July 29th after the destacked core stage engine section elements were both parked in the VAB transfer aisle. These hardware moves are mostly a change of plans. Boeing seems to be moving out of the Space Systems Processing Facility and consolidating their SLS production at Kennedy Space Center to a single location, VAB High Bay 2, where the Core Stage Vertical Integration Center is. Even though it's a large tool, there's still more floor space and volume left inside High Bay 2. The Boeing article notes that the also incomplete engine section for Core Stage 4 will eventually be moved from the SSPF to the VAB in the coming months. One of the advantages the SSPF was said to have over Michoud was a 100K rated cleanroom environment. So I guess they're going back to the MAF style of open-air production, where they will have to build up and tear down environmental enclosures again, as they did in New Orleans. These are the types of questions I asked in the past, but this is another example of how disconnected Artemis is from the public now. It's been 2 years since Boeing did an interview, and there's only so much that media relations can do. Moving all the Boeing SLS production resources at Kennedy Space Center from the SSPF to VAB High Bay 2 appears to be a second reorganization in less than 3 years. First, Boeing reorganized engine section production and final core stage assembly from Michoud in New Orleans to 2 facilities at Kennedy Space Center in late 2022, and now it looks like they are consolidating from 2 facilities to 1 at the Space Center. Bigger picture, it doesn't matter as much where Boeing builds engine sections and core stages as when they complete and deliver them to NASA for launch processing. Later in the day, via NASA Marshall Public Affairs, the SLS program provided a good overview of the current status of Core Stage 3 engine section integration and the forward outlook for the element and for the build overall, and actually maybe for Artemis III. Here's the statement. It says, quote, "The core stage engine section for the Artemis III mission was planned to move from the SSPF to the VAB in late 2025. As a part of a schedule acceleration effort for Artemis III, the decision was made to move the engine section to the VAB earlier than planned. A unique piece of ground handling equipment is being fabricated to hold the assembled engine section barrel and bow tail during transport, but with the accelerated schedule, that transportation tool was not ready in time to support relocation of the assembled engine section. Therefore, the decision was made to intentionally disconnect the boat tail from the engine section, transport the boat tail and barrel separately, and reconnect the 2 articles in the VAB transfer aisle before placing the engine section inside the Core Stage Vertical Integration Center in VAB High Bay 2. The engine section will stay there, where we will continue integration and test operations before the top 4/5 is shipped to Kennedy Space Center for stacking of Core Stage 3, planned for spring 2026." Unquote. So the engine section completion had slid from the middle of this year to the end of 2025. Boeing says that the move to the VAB is partly to consolidate resources in one location, and NASA says they will also help improve the Core Stage 3 schedule. Boeing had a transportation tool for the engine section and boat tail that worked for moving a few hundred meters indoors at Michoud, but the trip from the SSPF to the VAB is a few kilometers, and the tool they were building for that isn't ready yet, so that explains why the Core Stage 3 elements were destacked. They can move them individually. We saw that most recently last September. After they were destacked, we knew they had to be restacked, but this tells us the bolting will happen in the transfer aisle, and then they will be installed in the vertical integration center in High Bay 2, where welds and other integrations need to be redone. If stacking of the engine section with the upper 4/5 of the stage is planned next spring 2026, then both of those subassemblies will need to be more or less complete by that time. If spring 2026 means the end of spring 2026, then that's the end of June 2026, or the end of the third quarter, beginning of the last quarter of fiscal year 2026. Overall, we now have an updated schedule and updates to the forecasted roadmap. NASA and Boeing are currently forecasting the stage would be completed and be ready for handover to Exploration Ground Systems in that last quarter of FY 2026, basically a year from now. That was already kind of the deadline for it to be ready to support the current Artemis III launch date, which remains mid-2027. The schedule acceleration effort for Artemis III is interesting, but also seems more like schedule preservation. A year ago, the forecast was for the stage to be complete and ready to hand over to EGS at the end of this year, which would be well ahead of a need date for stacking. That's part of the remaining mystery, so to speak, which is the question of how well engine section integration is going, and will Boeing and SLS make these currently forecasted quote-unquote dates for completion of the engine section and the stage as a whole unit. If the overall completion date of the stage can be kept in the last quarter of the next fiscal year, in other words, somewhere between July and October 2026, then that would still support a mid-2027 Artemis III target launch date. All the other SLS hardware is basically ready to stack: the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the boosters, the engines, and the launch vehicle stage adapter. NASA recently published some footage of that being moved in March to a storage location at Marshall in Huntsville, where it will stay until stacking is closer. Overall, that's the basic mystery for all the unfinished Artemis III elements: Starship, Axiom, SLS, and Orion. When will they be completed, and how do they plan on getting to there from here? It's a mystery across all four of those programs because most of the time that information is religiously concealed. In other news and notes, Blue Origin posted a picture of zero boil-off equipment on social media this week, saying that test equipment has demonstrated long-term storage of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. A couple of months ago, in a rare public presentation, officials for the company spoke about conducting testing of a prototype and a thermal vacuum chamber, which might be what we're looking at. The post talks about meeting NASA test objectives for this technology that is critical to their Blue Moon architecture and elements, like the lunar lander and the cislunar transporter. However, big picture, it's not clear what the Blue Moon HLS development schedule looks like. Recently, the Government Accounting Office wrote in their annual assessment of major NASA projects that Blue Origin planned to complete their critical design review basically now, August 2025. Based on that report, I sent in a couple of questions to the NASA HLS program. First, has Blue Moon already passed the Key Decision Point C review and entered Phase C of the NASA project lifecycle? If so, did NASA publish the cost and schedule baselines that come out of KDPC? If not, where do things stand today for Blue Moon in terms of where it is in the project lifecycle, the forecast for KDPC completion, and the forecast for critical design review completion? In other words, big picture, where is the Blue Moon HLS project? Here is the official response from NASA, which basically sidesteps those questions. This is unfortunately a normal response. The KDPC cost and schedule baselines are supposed to be made public, and KDPC occurs at the beginning of Phase C, well before the critical design review. So, based on the non-response response, it's hard not to conclude that Blue Moon and HLS aren't close to CDR for the Mark II crew version of their lunar lander yet. It looks like they haven't entered Phase C yet either, and that NASA hasn't calculated the cost and schedule baselines for Mark II. That was completed for SpaceX's Starship HLS over a year and a half ago, which is where the February 2028 baseline estimate for Starship originates from. When NASA selected Blue Origin to be the second HLS provider in May 2023, they were required to complete the Lunar Orbit Checkout Review by April of 2028. That is a review for the crewed lunar lander that was planned to support Artemis V. The review would be held as one of the final go-no-goes to launch Orion and crew on SLS to begin the official Artemis V mission. Artemis V has been rescheduled to no earlier than 2030, and when NASA does those joint confidence level cost and schedule calculations for Blue Moon Mark II, we should expect to see a new, later date. There was another Artemis III note or detail from the presentation by Dr. Lori Glaze last week to the National Academies. Dr. Glaze is the acting head of the Exploration Directorate, and she noted that the Orion docking module hardware, which will be flying for the first time on Artemis III, was assembled at the Kennedy Space Center and shipped to Lockheed Martin's facilities in the Denver metro area in June for proto-qualification testing there. She said the plan is for the hardware to ship back to KSC in the November timeframe for eventual installation on the crew module. Big picture, she only spoke in detail about Artemis II and III. And that's because NASA can't talk about Artemis IV or beyond in any detail right now, because the agency is a part of the executive branch that wants to start Artemis over with Artemis IV. The White House still plans to terminate SLS and Orion in 2028 unless they are forced to follow an enacted law that says otherwise. Artemis II and Artemis III are the only remaining missions the White House and Office of Management and Budget are willing to launch using Orion and SLS, and only if they happen in the next 2 years. As I've been noting, the Artemis III target date in mid-2027 is in jeopardy due to program delays across the board. There's time to fly Artemis II, but there's not much margin left to fly Artemis III in 2027, even if a lunar landing attempt were set aside. The lunar landers that NASA has contracted with SpaceX and Blue Origin to develop aren't likely to be ready until at least 2028, and maybe later than that, given delays to both. Congress wants to reject immediate cancellation of Gateway, SLS, and Orion, and they want to increase funding for lunar lander development in hopes of reducing delays and trying to win the race they champion between the US and China to land the next people on the moon. More money for the HLS program could help, but NASA just lost over 20% of its workforce. The White House implemented a forced retirement program early this year. Cutting workforce was their top priority, and it was basically their first big initiative, bigger than Mars or the Moon. They have plans to further cut the workforce beginning in October. The effects of the loss of expertise and experience will be felt long-term and could have immediate effects on the schedules of programs that Congress is trying to help with more money, like HLS. But it could have qualitative effects too, not just the quantitative 20% cut. Now that the White House has cut 20% of the agency workforce, it is looking to cut the NASA contractor workforce next. As Keith Cowing, editor of NASA Watch, reported on Friday, August 1st, and anticipated the day before, a number of NASA contractors began sending WARN Act notices to their workforces. The notices provide a 60-day advance warning of possible large layoffs. As I was just saying earlier, fiscal year 2026 begins on October 1st, and the White House and Office of Management and Budget plan to continue to slash the overall NASA workforce at that time. Even if Congress passes funding for NASA programs, work still requires people to do the jobs. The White House seems to be the only one that wants to get rid of many NASA programs and most of the Artemis ones, including Orion and SLS. By firing large parts of the workforce, the White House can terminate progress first, and then maybe the programs it wants later. There were a lot of moving parts to the news feed this week, so here's a couple of late-breaking news items, both related to Artemis III. At the end of the week, SpaceX completed a set of static hot-fire tests of the next ship prototype that is now assigned to Starship Flight Test 10. The flight test was delayed due to the destruction of the previous ship prototype during a static fire test attempt in mid to late June. Just a couple of weeks ago, Elon Musk had forecast a launch attempt for Flight Test 10 in the first week of August, but in the early hours of Friday, he was now saying the launch has been delayed to mid-August. Even though Starship development continues to be behind schedule, just like all the other programs, acting NASA Administrator Sean Duffy told media at KSC as a part of a NASA social for the Crew 11 space station launch that he had just spoken with SpaceX about their Artemis III schedule.
I talked to their leadership team yesterday, talked to Gwen. They feel very comfortable on Starship. They feel like they're on page for the lander. on track. So they feel very good. They said if there's a holdup for Artemis III, it's not going to be them. I said, you promise me? And they said, yeah, I promise it's not going to be us. So they feel really good.
Similar to Boeing's schedule with SLS core stage production, SpaceX has about a year left to complete the Starship HLS tech demonstrations needed before Artemis III. SpaceX has a bigger challenge. They are transitioning to the next iteration of the vehicle, and for Artemis they need to complete all the demonstration objectives for ship-to-ship propellant transfer, then complete HLS Option A critical design review with NASA, and turn around any lessons learned into the uncrewed lunar landing demonstration. That uncrewed demo will include an initial subset of tankers and refueling and the first HLS prototype, which only has to land. There are no requirements to return from the moon back to Earth, so the plan is only for the uncrewed lander prototype to perform a hop from the lunar surface. All of that needs to be done by the end of next year, probably sooner than that, in order to then turn around lessons learned from the uncrewed demo by the end of next year, early 2027. All the tanker launches and refueling for the Artemis III crewed lunar landing demo have to happen in the months leading up to the official Artemis III launch. One of the NASA social participants for the Crew 11 space station launch also caught a great picture of the core stage 3 engine section and bow tail in the process of being restacked on July 31st. We saw bits and pieces of this process the first time they were stacked in the SSPF early last fall. The bow tail was delivered there in early September last year, and we can see it was first set up in that same tooling. Then we saw pictures of the engine section and bow tail in the SSPF after they were mated, one in late October and another in mid-January. In the pictures from last week showing the wrapped-up boat tail on its transportation tooling and still on the transporter, we could also see that same tooling had been set up on the floor of the VAB transfer aisle in front of High Bay 2. In this picture posted on social media from July 31st, the engine section and the quad pods that are fitted to it are sitting in the tool now, which allows the boat tail to be mated to the bottom of the barrel. This is what the mated engine section and bow tail were sitting on while they were in the SSPF after being mated last year. And it'll be what they sit on in the transfer aisle temporarily. Here, they will only stay in the tooling after being restacked until the engine section and bow tail are lifted up into the big Core Stage Integration Center tool in High Bay 2. The quad pods will still be there, and that's how the engine section bow tail will be secured in the big tool. It's the same way that the full Artemis II Core Stage 2, was secured in the tool late last year. In that case, the quad pods were attached to the tool first, and then the core stage was lowered down into place. In this case, the quad pods are already attached to the engine section, and then they will be bolted into the tool when the engine section is lowered into place. So there's a clearer outlook at the end of this week for the Artemis III SLS core stage. Next week, we'll be looking to see how the Artemis II crew testing inside their Orion spacecraft went, and upcoming processing milestones. The politics between Congress and the White House hang over everything, but Congress won't return for recess until September. Thanks as always for watching. Like and subscribe if you find these videos informative and want to find out what's going on with Artemis every week. Before I go, a big thanks as usual to the members of the YouTube channel who are helping to make it possible to keep doing these videos. I am posting additional content and more frequent updates for members if you're interested in joining. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to support what I do, I would also really appreciate it. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.